Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20. And here today we begin a series of lectures examining another key development in post-World War II global history, the phenomenon of decolonization. What we will see in lectures to come, something we've already begun to discuss in the context of the Cold War, is that after World War II, the global order shifts dramatically as France, Great Britain, Germany, the major powers who had dominated the global system since the 19th century, recede in power. And at the same time, there are these intense movements in Africa, Asia, Latin America, by local people in those regions who want the ability to govern themselves. And this leads to a wave of decolonization where Germany, France, Great Britain lose their empires and independent states emerge in Africa, Asia, Latin America. But of course, as we've already noted, all of that plays out, the story of decolonization, in the context of the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union are attempting to influence this process of decolonization. So there are two major trends in post-1945 global history. There's the Cold War, which we've already examined and is now in your mental orbit, and decolonization. And the two are deeply connected. You already know a great deal about the Cold War, and so we'll build on that foundation to inform you about these processes of decolonization that take place in the context of the Cold War. The Cold War deeply influences decolonization, and decolonization takes place in different ways, through different processes, in different parts of the world. So this begins a phase in the class where we're going to look at different forms of decolonization informed by what we know is also going on in this period, the Cold War. This is a period in the class where we will look at comparative forms of decolonization, beginning here in this lecture with decolonization in China. So, buckle up, here we go. All right, let's begin our study of decolonization of China with a story of how we can think of China being colonized. When the 20th century began, China was a traditional society in the way in which we've defined that in this class, with a small group of people who control land and a large population of landless peasants, and a ruling system that concentrates power in the hands of a monarch, in this case an emperor, who's supported by a group of aristocrats known in Chinese society as mandarins, who control the land and also are part of the government bureaucracy in positions of power, as mandarins also wield government power on a local level. So it does again meet those elements of a traditional society that we discussed much earlier in the class, with this corporeal society idea of a head and then a body, and everyone in their proper position in order for the society to function. A traditional society is one that is agrarian, and so the economy of China in the early 20th century, not industrialized, is an agrarian economy where a few control land and the majority work upon that land as peasants. As peasants, there's no incentive for them to work harder, grow more food, because they don't own the land, and whatever surplus food they create, they can't eat, and so it's just wasted. So the Chinese economy is pre-industrial. It has not yet been transformed by those developments that we talked about in our first lecture that are developing in the 18th and 19th century in certain parts of the world, in parts of Europe, the United States. China is a rural agrarian economy with little innovation, little technological development, little industrialization, and a corporeal society, a traditional society where power is concentrated in the hands of a few. And with it comes a sense that this is the way things should be, this is the way they've always been. There are traditions in culture, in religion that undergird this as the best way to organize society. This is the way things are, this is the way they've always been. This is the best way to organize society. But the problem for the Chinese was that a number of Western powers who were industrialized began to covet access to markets in China, to raw materials produced in China. You have what we've also talked about earlier in the class, the trends that are driving imperialism. No one European power colonizes China, so it's different than colonization that we see in other parts of the world. The British controlling India, the United States controlling the Philippines, France colonizing Indochina. It doesn't follow that model of colonization, where one European power consolidates control through various means of this society. Instead, China, so large and so coveted by a variety of Western powers, is besieged by many European and American efforts to control various parts of this large country, rich in resources, with a large marketplace for industrial goods. There are certain raw materials and products that Western powers want to extract. Many of them are unavailable to them in their home countries, like tea, for example, which doesn't grow in frosty England. And so there's this quest for materials in China. There's this desire to sell everyone in China industrial imported goods. And so France, Great Britain, the United States, they're all seeking to control various parts of China, and China's carved up accordingly. So it's an underdeveloped economy. It's an economy with a large peasant population who lives in poverty. It's a static society that rejects change, embraces tradition, keeping things the way they are. But in the 19th century, China is subject to this process of Western imperialism that further weakens Chinese society, and as we'll talk about here in just a moment, serves to advertise the weakness of China. Now, China had long been the great power in this region. We discussed this in regards to the Japanese Empire, how China for centuries had been the great power in East Asia, the seedbed of so much innovation in terms of technology, patterns of governance, education, culture, and then exported that in many ways to other parts of East Asia. Japanese culture so deeply inflected and influenced by Chinese culture. But in the 19th and early 20th century, China is increasingly aware that it has regressed, that it has been eclipsed, that it is weakened by this process of Western imperialism. Not only are Western imperialists arriving seeking to dominate resources in China, exact power and control of various regions of China, subject China to a forced process of being integrated into the industrial order, there are also cultural imperialistic forces plaguing Chinese society and culture, namely Christian missionaries who come from European nations, come from the United States. They are armed with the belief that Chinese culture is inferior. It's the age of social Darwinism. It's the age of this racist way of interpreting the different societies and peoples of the world that argues that white Western people are inherently superior, and with it, all of their elements of their culture are superior, that the world should speak English or European languages, worship Christ, and reflect what is imagined to be Western culture, Western values. And so here come these do-gooders, these Christian missionaries who arrive with this very bigoted point of view that Chinese culture is backward, that Chinese religion is a false religion, superstitious, and they want to transform China by turning everyone in China into a good little Christian. So not only is the Chinese population besieged by underdevelopment and efforts of exploitation and extraction by Europeans, they're also subject to this effort of cultural imperialism that asserts that Christianity is the only valid religion, that Chinese religiosity, whether it's Buddhism, Confucianism, is backward, superstitious. And so the Chinese people are besieged by these efforts that are designed to destroy their culture and impose a foreign religion and foreign culture upon them, and that further advertises the weakness of the Chinese society and, most importantly here, the weakness of the emperor and the traditional power brokers to safeguard Chinese society. In the 1830s, you get the First Opium War, where the British fight a war to open up China so that they can extract resources and sell goods to the Chinese. And the only thing the British offer is opium, a drug, in order to gain access to Chinese resources and materials that they could bring back to Great Britain. So the Chinese population is being introduced to narcotics. It's being subject to exploitive economic efforts to extract resources from China. It's being subject to Christian missionaries. All of this demonstrates the unique pattern of colonization in China. Well, another insight that we've developed earlier in the class is also important to be mindful of here, activates here, nationalism. Nationalism is a contagion in the late 19th, early 20th century. It is active around the globe, and now at this point we've seen many examples of that, and the same is true in China. The Chinese are nationalists. They too believe in this idea of a strong nation, and they're committed to kicking out these Europeans and Americans who have come and exploited, foist their culture and religion upon the Chinese people, who have brought their racism and bigotry because they're convinced that China is this backward state. The Chinese are proud of their society and culture and nation. And so in the turn of the 20th century, 1899, 1900, 1901, there's an uprising in China known as the Boxer Rebellion. Now, this has nothing to do with boxer like Jack Johnson or my dog. The term Boxer Rebellion refers to young nationalists who are angry that these outsiders, these Europeans, have come and polluted, corrupted the great Chinese civilization. And they're angry that their government has made the Chinese society and its people so vulnerable to these outsiders. If in a traditional society you have a head and a body, the head has all the power, but they're supposed to use that power to protect the entire body. And it's very clear to young Chinese nationalists that the emperor, the mandarins, the aristocrats, the landed elite have failed because they've opened the society to the efforts of Europeans and Americans who, again, have launched this imperial effort against the Chinese that's designed to extract wealth, make the Chinese a market for Western goods, and impose Western religion upon the Chinese. So you have these young upstarts. You have these young nationalists who believe in their own culture, society, its worth, its value, and they resent these Western Europeans, these Americans who have come and imposed imperialism upon the Chinese, as well as the failure of the Chinese government to protect local people. But the Boxer Rebellion ultimately is suppressed by the efforts of the Americans and the British, European powers who want to, again, maintain this advantageous effort that they have in China, this effort to colonize China. And Western armies are called out to suppress the Boxer Rebellion, to stamp out this resistance, and they are able to operate in this fashion in China, warring against the Boxers with the help of the emperor. And this only makes things worse because here's further evidence that our government is on the side of these outsiders, that our government can't protect not just our people, but the value and worth of this great civilization, this great society. So the emperor sides with the outsiders and gives them an opportunity to wage a war against a counter-revolutionary effort against the Boxers, and that only validates their argument that something is very wrong in the governance of this nation. You see that here in this political cartoon, which represents how the United States was fighting against the Boxer Rebellion. The man wielding the sword there is President William McKinley, who we met earlier in the class as the man who presides over the Spanish-American War, the very beginning of the U.S.-Philippine War. He is the President of the United States at the turn of the 20th century who sets in motion conflicts and actions that lead to the rise of the American empire in this period. And the United States was intervening in the Philippines and China at this moment. In fact, the reason why the United States really wants the Philippines is as a gateway to Japan and China, to use it as a springboard for further actions of imperial effort to colonize China. And so this is a political cartoon from an American publication here representing McKinley and Uncle Sam as fighting bravely against these Boxers, these young Chinese nationalists who want to prevent this process by which their nation is carved up in this fashion. So the Boxer Rebellion is a good early example of nationalism in China. Decolonization efforts. It's sort of the first blow in the 20th century of an effort to rid China of these outsiders, these imperialists, these colonizers who have taken advantage of a weakened China with the complicity of the government in a way that's ruinous and terrible for the Chinese people. The Boxer Rebellion is ultimately suppressed, but nationalism is not. That's also an insight we've seen in other instances in the class. Ho Chi Minh doesn't give up in his efforts to establish a free and independent Vietnam. And though the Boxer Rebellion is suppressed, the nationalism that's underneath it, that's fueling it, gets stronger in the early 20th century as a new class of young nationalists, many of them educated in parts of the West, educated in liberalism, modernity. They see other parts of the world that have been developed, and they want that for China. They want to rid China of, again, these imperialists. So the Boxer Rebellion is the first act of decolonization in the early 20th century. And though it's suppressed, the undercurrents below it grow. And you have in the early 20th century, in the decades that follow the Boxer Rebellion, this growing class of young, educated nationalists, often within institutions in China like the army, who want to secure an independent China free of Western imperialism. One of those nationalists was Sun Yat-sen, who is recognized as the father of modern Chinese nationalism. He was born into the peasantry, but thanks to the meritocracy that existed to some extent in the Chinese army, he was able to gain an education, particularly in modern ideas like liberalism, nationalism. He was able to travel and receive an education abroad and see directly different societies, particularly more advanced and developed societies. He interacted with British in Hong Kong, which was really the seat of British colonialism in China. And so we have a story of a young nationalist with aspirations who becomes increasingly educated, conscious of simultaneously different ways of organizing society, liberalism, the modern nation states that were developing in this period, and the lack of development in his own China. And so from this, he becomes dedicated to revolutionary change that will create in China a modern liberal republic. He wants to create in China the sort of liberal society, government that he has learned about, interacted with in parts of the world that have been transformed through liberal revolutions. So he wants to bring those trends to China and vault China into a modern nation state in line with the development of modern nation states in different parts of the world. He is one of these liberal reformers who is frustrated by the ossification, the calcification of the traditional society. This is, again, something we talked about earlier in the class, where in the 18th and 19th century, as a result of industrialization, as a result of new ideas, education, new technologies, there's this rising class of upstarts who want to reform society or revolutionize society by breaking away from those traditional elements that retard and limit change and advance a new system where people like them, the educated elite, can rise to positions of power and control. They don't want to stay in their place. They don't want to respect the tradition, especially in China in this period where there are so many problems with the traditional society. Weak, unable to protect Chinese society, complicit with foreigners, betraying in many ways Chinese society and its people. So Sun Yat-sen meets that model that we've seen earlier of nationalists, liberal reformers, people who want to break free from the limits imposed upon them by traditional society and advance dramatic change that will vault China into a modern nation state. Another element of Sun Yat-sen that's here that we want to be mindful of, that we've seen in other stories like this, note that he left China. He went outside the nation and then came back. And that's a very, very common theme, element of nationalists in this period. We'll see it soon with Gandhi, the nationalist figure in the story of the decolonization of India. It's the story of Jose Rizal, who through very unique ways becomes this figure in Filipino nationalism and helps to spark that revolution, first against the Spanish and then the Americans. People who leave and go away. And that's really important to nationalism in a number of ways. One, those people who leave are often educated in modern ideas like liberalism. They interact with liberal societies. They see concretely in front of them modernity, industrialization, and that makes them keenly, sharply aware of the lack of development in their own country. So they learn about new ideas. They see change directly as they are abroad. That makes them conscious of the lack of change and development in their own country, which bolsters their commitment and faith to bringing that change to their society. And they're conscious of always being outsiders. When they're traveling abroad, when they are learning in foreign universities, in foreign institutions, they're always asked, who are you? Where are you from? Perhaps you've had this experience if you've traveled abroad before the pandemic. And wherever you go, you're often asked, who are you? Where are you from? And you explain, oh, I live in Riverside, California, and I'm a student at UCR, and I'm traveling here. You're constantly telling your story. You're constantly relaying your biography. And what that does is it makes you aware you don't belong here, that you belong back there in Riverside or the United States, that you're an outsider in this country, that you'll never be accepted as a full member of that society because you're seen as this interloper, this outsider. And what that does is it urges you to be keenly aware of your nationalism. You're often not aware of being American, or consciously, if you are an American and if you are born here and if you think of yourself as an American, you're often not really conscious of it until you leave the nation. It's one of the many ironies of nationalism. You're not keenly, sharply aware of your Americanness until you leave America. It's sort of counterintuitive. You think when you're in America, you look around, oh, this is America, and this is my country, and there's the flag, and I'm so un-American. But actually, you're more conscious of your Americanness when you leave, when you're abroad. One, because you see different ways of being, but also you have this process of constantly testifying to who you are in this process of relaying your biography. I'm from there. I'm from Southern California, right? I'm a student at UC Riverside. And that's what's happening to Sun Yat-sen and Jose Rizal and all of these other nationalists in this period. So there's a lot here that is unique to Sun Yat-sen and the story of China in the early 20th century, but there's a lot here too that's comparable, similar to other agents of nationalism that we have encountered or will encounter in lectures to come. Sun Yat-sen begins to put his idea into action, and he forms this group of young officers like him in the military who are angry and frustrated at the weakness of Chinese society, angry and frustrated that they're told to stay in their place and defer to the elite, the traditional rulers of society. And Sun Yat-sen is a very persuasive figure. He has a magnetic quality, and people begin to rally around him, recognizing his leadership and the way in which he articulates a widely felt sentiment among these young nationalists. And that, too, is something we've heard before, right? One guy, one figure often crystallizes a sea of energies below him or her. One person, because they're so passionate, persuasive, can mobilize a larger movement, and that's the case in this instance for Sun Yat-sen. And in October of 1911, he launches a revolt in southern China in an effort to create a liberal republic, in an effort to create China as a modern nation state with a liberal constitution, a bureaucracy, a modern nation state. Let's purge China of these foreigners. Let's industrialize and make China itself a great modern nation. He establishes Nanking as the capital, and that's why earlier in the class when we talked about the rape of Nanking, Nanking was at one point the capital of China. And he's elected president, and he's, in this instance, set in motion a process of establishing here in the southern part of China a modern nation state with elections and presidents, a strong executive, elements of, again, a liberal government and a liberal constitution. But in this time of tumult and chaos, uncertainty, weakness, in the years that followed the Boxer Rebellion, there are many who are vying to aggrandize their power and control and dismantle this weakened traditional society. And that brings us to Yoon Shikai, who in the north also wages an effort to overthrow local rulers and leaders, displace the aristocracy, and he seizes power and establishes his own regime, not based on a liberal constitution or an effort to mimic liberal republics, but installing himself as a potentate of sorts through his control of coercive power in the military. And so you've got two states now established, one in the north, headed by Shikai, who is in this position of power based on his ability to mobilize coercive power. He has established effectively a military regime. And then in the south, you have the efforts of Sun Yat-sen, who is espousing this idea of modernity, development, a liberal republic, who is elected president and has this vision of creating a liberal republic in the south, but who is ultimately going to prevail. The answer to that is a compromise. Sun Yat-sen steps down from his position as president in the republic he established and recognizes Shikai as the new leader of China, but only when Shikai decides to incorporate the liberal reforms that Sun Yat-sen most coveted. Most important to Sun Yat-sen was to put China on a pathway towards modernity and development. That's the most important thing for Sun Yat-sen. It's the product of his anger and frustration at the weak Chinese society that had been so besieged by outsiders, colonizers, He's convinced that China must do this. China must embrace these reforms. He's a true believer in liberalism, in nationalism, in industrialization. He, again, learned about those processes, saw them, and he sees them as the future. That's the way forward. Follow me. I've got the idea, and he's willing to step aside personally to make that possible. So he enters into this agreement with Shikai that will put Shikai still in this position of power, but create underneath him a liberal republic. However, China is a huge country, and it's hard to consolidate power, particularly in this very abrupt process of dismantling centuries of a traditional society and creating this new liberal republic, even with the powerful Shikai at the top. And so what we have now is really a period of uncertainty, tumult, where consolidating power in a new republic, in a new government, proves to be very, very difficult. In this large country, with local warlords, with local elites themselves, each invested in creating new positions of power and authority or preserving their established positions of authority. So the old traditional society has crumbled, and it's not yet clear what will take its place. The process of European and American imperialism and colonialism going back to the early 19th century had really displaced centers of power, had weakened Chinese society, had disrupted Chinese society with the imposition of Western ideas or Western religiosity. It had created a really fractured society without a core, without a center, and without a strong position of power and authority, even with the emperor preserved. That had been going on for almost a century now. And so China was a fractured society. This is part and parcel of colonialism. This is what the British do in Africa. This is what the French do in Indochina. This is what the United States does in the Philippines and parts of Latin America that the United States colonizes in the early 20th century. You don't want to have a center of power. You don't want to have a locus of power that could potentially contest or challenge the power wielded by the colonizer. You want to fracture the society. You want to break it up into little parts and little pieces so that there's no countervailing force. That's easy to neutralize resistance to your efforts to consolidate imperial control. And that's what happened to China. It was fractured into many different pieces, and now consolidating control is a very difficult task for Shikai, and this thwarts this process of decolonization in China. So this period in the 1920s, the 1930s, the interwar period in China is really marked by chaos, tumult, as you have an effort to establish a republic, and then all of this infighting in different regions of China, a lot of it fueled and advanced by Western powers who benefit again from such a fractured society. So overall, it's a period of uncertainty. In 1916, Yoon Shikai dies, and with that, Sun Yat-sen takes up this campaign to now emerge as the leader of this effort to create a liberal republic in China. He forms the Nationalist Party and remains committed to this idea of creating a republican government in China. But again, you have a very difficult time consolidating that control. Here's a brand new government and attempting to establish that in a society that's been so fractured by colonialism. And in this period, European, American powers are more than happy to foment this chaos and prevent the consolidation of power under Sun Yat-sen. And now comes another faction that's vying to establish a new republic in China with a very different message and answer to this question of how best to form an independent state. That cause, with a very different approach, is now taken up by the Chinese Communist Party. It's 1921, and a new effort develops in China in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. So this is a point we made earlier in the class. The Russian Revolution was modular. It offered a model of how to do this. It took an ideology that developed among Marx and others in the 19th century and put it into action. And there is a great fear in some circles and hope in others that what happened in Russia could now happen in other parts of the world. We've talked about that as one of the elements of 1920s global history, the fear of a communist revolution around the globe. For Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, this is potential hope that what began in Russia could now transpire in China, and he becomes a rival to the nationalists with his prescription of how to advance China, rid China of, in this case, capitalists, industrialists, colonizers, and create a thriving modern state built on a communist model, built on a vision of redistributing wealth, of dislodging the propertied class. And so Mao Zedong stylizes his party as the real answer to the problems plaguing Chinese society. Sun Yat-sen would die in 1925, and taking up the cause of the nationalist movement and the nationalist parties, the man you see here on the right, Chiang Kai-shek. And in the 20s and 30s, this would now be the great rivalry in China, a battle between the communists, led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalist movement, now inherited and advanced by Chiang Kai-shek after the death of Sun Yat-sen. So we still have chaos. We still have disorder. We have a power vacuum in China, as effectively a civil war has now developed between the nationalists and the communists, and now enter the Japanese, who have their own intentions in Asia, and in particular to be the great hegemon in the region, and for reasons we noted early in the class, in particular, set their sights on controlling China. And I described earlier the Chinese invasion of China as another act of colonialism or imperialism. The rhetoric may have been Asia for the Asians, we're here to liberate you, but of course their goal was instead to be the now controller, master of China. And so the Japanese enter as a colonizer, initially establishing a foothold in Manchuria, and then in 1937 launching their full-scale invasion of China. So this only amplifies the disorder and chaos. Chinese people have lived through, first, their nation colonized by Europeans, Americans, the extraction, exploitation that went along with that, the deliberate effort to retard and limit development within China to instead exploit that for the interests of these industrial nations. They've lived through the cultural imperialism we talked about earlier, Christian missionaries coming in and trying to stamp out Chinese culture, importing into China this sense of Western superiority. Now they've lived through the time of tumult that began with the establishment of a republic under Sun Yat-sen, the rivalry with Shikai, and the local battles in various parts of China in the 1920s. And now there's a civil war between two different factions, the nationalists and the communists, compounded by invasion by a foreign power, the Japanese, who occupied China again in a rather brutal fashion, as we described earlier, in events like the rape of Nanking. So hopefully you're getting a sense of how terrible this time is for the Chinese people as the process of establishing a modern republic in China plays out in this very difficult and tragic fashion. So during World War II, we have effectively a civil war between three different factions here, the nationalists, the communists, and the Japanese, and the fate of China at this moment is really unclear. By 1945, the Japanese are defeated, as we discussed in our lectures on World War II, and the nationalists lost favor with the Chinese people, in part because many of them collaborated with the Japanese. When the Japanese occupied China, many nationalists cast their lot with Japan. partly because they believed, well, Japan is this mighty power and they're here to stay. They don't have a crystal ball, and they don't know that Japan will be defeated and expelled from Asia in World War II. So for many, this was a chance to curry favor with the Japanese and find a position within a Japanese control of China that many believed was here to stay. Also, many of the nationalists felt a connection with the Japanese because they admired the way Japan had become such a modern industrial power. They were nationalists. They were liberals. They wanted to industrialize and modernize China. And so they don't have an ideological rivalry with the Japanese the way the communists do, who see the Japanese as capitalists, imperialists, and oppose the Japanese occupation because it jeopardizes the communist revolution in China. And so the communists were really able to make better gains in terms of popular support during the Chinese Civil War because they weren't complicit. Patriotism plays a key role here. The communists did not side with the Japanese, and so the people see the communists as truly one of them and safeguards, vanguards against Japanese imperialism. And the communists have that appealing message. It's not bread, land, and peace in this case. It's land, it's rice, it's sustenance, it's reform, it's economic reform, redistribution, coupled with victory against the Japanese. And so the nationalists, some of them are complicit in collaboration, and they are seen, therefore, as no different than these other colonizers, coupled with the Chinese communists' steadfast commitment to purging their nation of outsiders and their very appealing message of land reform, land, redistribution of wealth, and victory against these outsiders, betrayers, those who are complicit. And so ultimately, in 1949, the Chinese Civil War comes to an end with victory for the communists, and this begins communist control of China. Mao Zedong declares the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists flee to Taiwan. And in our most recent lecture, we talked about détente, and we talked about Nixon opening China. I noted that Nixon's trip to China was so significant because prior to that, the United States refused to recognize that the communists had controlled China as they had since 1949. Instead, the United States recognized the government in Taiwan, the vestige of Chiang Kai-shek's efforts, as the real government in China. It was a way of refusing to accept Chinese communist control. And so Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan, and the communists consolidate their control over China. And so in 1949, the largest country on earth, Soviet Union, was communist. And now the largest country on earth in terms of population, China, also communist, with many effects that, again, we described in our lectures on the Cold War, the Korean War, the fear of communism spreading through Asia that undergirded America's actions in Vietnam, later the détente era and the effort to open China. So there are so many consequences to this. Chinese control, a communist control of China that we've already talked about. It's really a chance for us to now braid together what we've learned about the Cold War and what we're learning here about the story of consolidation of control by the communists in China. So the Chinese Civil War ends, this time of tumult, with a clear winner, the communists, who now have control over China in 1949. So let's tack back and summarize where we are at this point. When we began our story of China in around the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, 1900, China was a traditional society, but one that had been troubled by underdevelopment, a large impoverished peasant class, and foreign imperialism. Then came Sun Yat-sen and his remedy for that: liberalism, a modern republic, but ultimately it was difficult to consolidate control, and that led to another faction developing, Mao Zedong represented here, and his message of communism and the way in which that resonated with the Chinese people, who again for a century had been beset by foreign imperialism. Communism was a counter force to Western imperialism, industrialization. The communists were not complicit with Japanese imperialism, and so you have a patriotic, nationalistic sentiment to their efforts and appeal. And then, of course, most importantly, like we've talked about earlier with radical transformations, there was a way forward, a vision that appealed to the masses, and that was land reform, redistribution of wealth, the idea of creating China as a modern Marxist communist state. And so that helps us explain how at the end of this process that began with the Boxer Rebellion and the process of decolonization in the early 20th century ultimately led to the formation of a communist state in China by the midpoint of the 20th century. Okay, let's now talk about the post-1949 period. Let's talk about the period of communist rule in China in the second half of the 20th century in the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War. Well, in 1949, the communists consolidated their control of China, but now they faced a huge new challenge. China was a nation that had been decimated by a century of European and American colonialism. It was a nation that had been ravaged by a ruinous civil war that raged on for the first half of the 20th century in the ways that we described here, beginning with the efforts of Sun Yat-sen, the time of chaos and uncertainty that followed, and then China was invaded by a foreign power during World War II, Japan, and then continuing even after World War II was that civil war. So China faced great strife, great misery in the first half of the 20th century. And now, with the communists in charge of China, they had to find a way to go forward and make China a prosperous, modern, industrial nation, but based on the communist model that had been central to the ideology and appeal of Mao Zedong and the Red Revolution. Remember, they promised land distribution, they promised reform, and they promised it to put China in line with that vision of a communist paradise of greater equity for all. But China was a nation that had again been ravaged by a century of colonialism, destroyed by a half century in the 20th century of war and strife and civil war. So doing that, making China a prosperous modern nation, was very, very difficult. It was a nation with a very large peasant class who did not own land and were impoverished. It had a little bit of industry in different parts of the country, but by no means was it an industrialized, developed nation. And though Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, there were still many people who were invested in the old system and many traditions in China who were disinclined towards the communist ideology and communist party. And so this was just a thumbnail sketch of the many challenges facing the Communist Party in their effort to now control China and vault it into a modern, prosperous nation. How to do that? Well, there emerged two camps, two groups within the Communist Party, within the Chinese government bureaucracy, who had very different proposals, very different visions for how to do this. One, the experts. These were people who were very pragmatic, less dogmatic, less committed to Marxist ideology, to communism as an ideology, as a pure vision of a way forward. The experts were willing to bring in elements of Western modernity, Western methodologies, Western industries, and patterns of industry modeled on the United States and Western European nations. So they were more pragmatic in that way, less dogmatic. They wanted a more flexible way of going forward that was not as adherent to communism as an ideology. And most of all, they believed in this idea of experts, as scientifically trained experts in positions of power that could, from on high, advance this program of modernity, industrialization, and making China a prosperous modern nation. On the other side were the Reds, and these were people who were more dogmatic, more committed to a Marxist ideology, who were suspicious of foreign intrusion, foreign ideas. They associated them with, again, capitalism, with imperialism, and efforts to short circuit or derail the linear progress of a communist state. And so in the second half of the 20th century, these two camps will joust with each other and rival each other for leadership in China. And as we'll talk about here, at various moments in the late 20th century, one of the two will be ascendant. In the very early period following the success of the Communist Revolution in China, the experts were in charge, and they followed their program of measured reforms, moderate change, flexibility, pragmatism, and of course the sparked backlash from the Reds, who saw the experts as betraying the communist ideal. So in the early 1950s, soon after the Communist Revolution, the experts wielded control and followed their program of success, which was based on scientifically trained experts in bureaucratic positions, wielding power, planning economic change, advancing slowly in a moderate fashion, the overall goal of land redistribution. They worked closely with Soviet advisors and brought them in as part of this process, overall transitioning in a series of 5-year plans towards an economy that again incorporated elements of industry and established small communal farms that allowed peasants to have some say over land that again they had been denied for most of China's history as landless individuals toiling on land owned by others. So this was the expert mode. This was the expert program. Trust us, we know best. We're going to plan this out. We're going to bring in advisors. We're going to execute slowly and in a moderate fashion change to the Chinese society and economy that will create greater prosperity and bring in new forms of industry, industrialize certain sectors of the Chinese economy, and set up these small communal farms that will satisfy the long-standing desire for land reform in China. That, when it failed to yield results that the communist officials and leaders in the Chinese communist government demanded, would open the door to a backlash led by the Reds, who said the experts have betrayed the revolution. They've pursued a slow plan that fails to deliver on what is most important in this effort, a redistribution of land and wealth. And so in the late 50s, early 60s, the Reds were ascendant and the experts receded into the background. The Reds took control of the Communist Party, the Communist Chinese bureaucracy and government, and announced a great leap forward, which would greatly accelerate this process and create a true vision in line with communist ideals of equality for all. Let's create these huge agrarian communities where everyone is toiling on these large farms producing rice and wheat and other key foodstuffs, and in doing so realize what we had long aspired to, a program of land redistribution that creates equality among the peasant class. So they were much less committed to industry, the Reds. They had this vision of a communist paradise, a communist society rooted in land and redistribution of land. And so they gained power wrested power from the experts and announced this great leap forward, which turned out to be a massive failure, led to massive starvation, stymied the Chinese economy, and of course opened the door to the resurgence of the experts. The Great Leap Forward was an absolute humanitarian disaster, crisis that led to starvation, death that we're never really able to truly calculate because it's hard, even to this day, to ascertain reliable numbers. But this was, by every measure, an absolute disaster, one that again opened up the door to the return of the experts. So you have this sort of, again, jousting, this rivalry between the two as to how to move China forward from its agrarian base into a modern, prosperous society, as well as how to balance those efforts with the ideological commitment to communism. The experts return after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, and for a brief moment, they are ascendant following their program of planning, of close contact and advice from the Soviet Union, and much more moderate forms of change with greater emphasis on industrialization. So by 1962, the Great Leap Forward had proved to be a great failure, and we get another moment of experts in charge. However, when experts once again failed to create enough tangible change and prosperity for China, there opened a door for a resurgence of a commitment to ideology, ideological purity, and in particular, a vision of China as indeed a Marxist state. And in the mid-60s, after once again the experts failed to achieve this radical and dramatic change, it's important to note that again, China was trying in a matter of years to transform this huge nation, this large population of people, to transform them in a way that took centuries in other parts of the world. And so experts or Reds, all of this was a rather unfair and really unrealizable goal. But when the experts inevitably failed again, the leader of China, the leader of the Communist Party in China, the leader of the Communist Revolution, declared that the experts had betrayed the revolution, and he launched what was known as the Cultural Revolution, where he blamed the failure of China to advance, to prosper, to emerge as one of the great nations of the world on these experts who betrayed the purity of Marxism, the purity of communism. And the Cultural Revolution was a purge. It was a purge of Chinese bureaucracy, Chinese government, of these experts. And by purge, I mean they were rounded up and killed because they were seen as enemies of the state. And through the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong wanted to take greater control over the Chinese government and really center it on one-man rule, consolidating control around him and demanding absolute loyalty within the government and within the Chinese Communist Party. And he employed the coercive means of the state to this end. He employed the Red Guard, the Chinese army, the police force within the Chinese government and state to round up, incarcerate, or kill those who were deemed impure, enemies of the revolution, collaborators with capitalists and outsiders. This is, again, the dynamic that we have seen so often in this class of outsiders, insiders, inclusion, and exclusion. Here along ideological lines and matters of political loyalty. Mao Zedong charged many with being disloyal. Disloyal to the revolution, disloyal to the communist ideology, and most importantly, disloyal to him. And without any restraint or compunction, he launched this campaign of violence and brutality against those he deemed indeed disloyal. The Cultural Revolution is known as the Cultural Revolution because beyond the political machinations here and the enmity among different factions and the aggrandizement of power around Mao Zedong, there was also a deliberate campaign to purge China of what Mao Zedong and his supporters saw as inhibitors drags on Chinese advancement and prosperity along ideological communist lines. The Cultural Revolution was a campaign against a lot of traditional Chinese culture, society. Elements of Chinese music, theater were banned. It was also a campaign against religiosity, Buddhism, Confucianism. What many true believers in the Cultural Revolution argued was that these old ways, these folk traditions, are again limiting our prosperity and advancement. We need to jettison these old ways, these old traditions, these old beliefs, and embrace solely communism and rally around Mao Zedong, the Communist Party, and the revolution. These are pollutants. These are impure elements of our society. They hold us back, and we need to, therefore, purge society of these emblems of our traditional society. And so books were burned. Again, performances of traditional theater and music banned. People also were rounded up and incarcerated as they were associated with this impurity to the revolution. And so that too was a key part of this Cultural Revolution. It was designed to answer the question, why haven't we prospered? Why haven't we advanced? We've rid China of foreigners. We have decolonized China. We have rid China of these forces associated with capitalism, liberalism. We won the revolution, and yet China hasn't emerged as this prosperous state where all again live in equality and prosperity. Well, the answer, of course, to that from a historical perspective is the very difficulties associated with modernizing China. But if you've promised this and failed to deliver, you look for scapegoats. And the scapegoats became political dissidents or members of different political factions, political enemies, and elements of Chinese culture, which again were seen as drags on the forward march of revolution. A lot of this became a one-man cult. The Cultural Revolution was about jettisoning traditional beliefs, religiosity, and instead worshiping the state in the form of Mao Zedong. And so massive posters of Mao hung everywhere in China. You were obligated to have a picture of Chairman Mao in your home. He published what was known as the Little Red Book, which was a book of Mao aphorisms, sayings, witticisms that the Chinese were required to have on them at all times. This is again a police state, and people were arrested, abused, often killed if they did not comply. The Little Red Book is arguably, I'm not quite sure the current rankings, but it's often seen as the most published book in the world. It is the most published book in the world because so many Chinese citizens are obliged to have one on them or in their home in a country of more than 1 billion people. And so you are to worship Mao, you are to have in your home a shrine to Mao, and you're supposed to carry this little red book. Well, this too was an absolute disaster. It too led to starvation, misery, despair, a lack of progress, and in 1974 it comes to an end about the same time that the détente policy is being established, and there's a new political reality in China with its opening of relations with the United States and its larger opening to the global economy. With the end of the Cultural Revolution, with the onset of the détente policy, and the failure, the very huge failure of the Cultural Revolution. Again, it's hard to get good estimates of death in this period in China because it was such a closed society, but some historians argue that 20 million people died in the Cultural Revolution alone in this period that spans roughly 9 years. Add that to the death toll and all the terrible events we've seen in China's history in the 20th century, and it's staggering. So an absolute disaster, absolute failure, and an absolute moment of true human misery and despair. The experts return, and they've largely ruled the Chinese government ever since. there hasn't really been a resurgence of true believers because the experts were many of the architects of the détente policy that opened China to the outside, encouraged foreign investment, allowed for some elements of private property, foreign investment in China, and that's the turn that we'll talk about in just a moment in our last slide that brings China into the present, as indeed after the Cultural Revolution, largely these experts with those commitments, those ideas, have controlled China and its government ever since the failure of the Cultural Revolution. 1976, Mao dies, Deng Xiaoping takes over, and he was part of that group of the experts. He was a believer in this idea of opening China to the global economy, encouraging foreign investment, and he purged the Chinese bureaucracy of many of those true believers in another wave of violence and repression. And so we're back to experts in charge. So let's indeed bring this into the contemporary era. As we've said now over the course of a couple lectures in the 1970s, you have this embrace of détente by the United States. Involved in that is opening relations with China, and that meant that Chinese goods could come into the United States, and that's made for major transformation in the global economy. So this open China, it established relations between the United States and China, and it's had key consequences for all of us as a result. This is advanced by the Chinese because after the failure of the Cultural Revolution, experts are in charge, and they are, as we've described in these last few slides, those who are more interested in the idea of an industrial development in the United States. They're not interested in some sort of Marxist vision where everyone is working on a communal farm. Instead, the experts were committed to this idea of rapid modernization of the Chinese economy, making China an industrial nation competing with the industrial nations around the world. And so the experts, more flexible, less dogmatic, less ideological, have welcomed in foreign investment. They've even allowed for elements of capitalism, some private ownership, some private property. And what you have now in China is, as a result, sort of the worst of both worlds, where they never achieved land reform. They never achieved reforms that would have truly helped improve the standard of living of the very large, poor population in China. And yet they have a government that, in terms of its political ideology and political rule, offers very little in terms of civil liberty. We talked in a recent lecture about uprisings in the 1980s in Eastern Europe that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, and a wave of revolution in Eastern Europe. Well, there was another protest against an absolutist authoritarian government in the late 80s. It took place in China, in protests in parts of China against oppression, against the lack of civil liberties, and the Chinese government called out the tanks and crushed the rebellion. And so you don't have what you have in Eastern Europe in the late 80s in China. You don't have a wave of change that grants to individuals in China greater political participation, greater civil liberties, protection for vulnerable minorities. It's quite the opposite in China. So it really is the worst of both worlds. They don't have a democratic government. They don't have a government that respects individual rights and civil liberties. You have oppression. You have oppression in particular against cultural and religious minorities. You have a closed system that's not responsive to the people, and you never really got true economic reform that would have brought together greater equity and opportunity for the impoverished class. You certainly have economic reform in terms of economic change with the opening of China and the changes that have come to the Chinese economy with industrialization, with its place in the global market. But no political reform since 1949, effectively communist rule, and even more so in the last few decades, greater oppression, greater efforts by the Chinese Communist Party to clamp down on dissent, And that makes China today in the 21st century a nation of great economic power and authority, but again, a closed society that either represses or oppresses its people, and a malevolent force in terms of the role that the Chinese government plays in limiting true political reform, civil liberties, and cultural change within China. So this has been the first of our explorations of a key trend in late 20th century world history, decolonization. In this lecture, we've told the story of the decolonization of China. In lectures to come, we'll look at other examples of decolonization, next in Africa, then in India, and through the course of these lectures have a chance to understand the various forms that decolonization does take. So join me for our next lecture where we turn our attention to the story of decolonization in Africa and make some key comparisons along the way in these lectures about these different forms of decolonization, just in case some jerk might ask you about that on an exam coming soon.